Welcome to Kinship Cafe. So glad you could join us this morning. We're going to continue our discussion in the Daodejing on chapter 18, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So we're going to kind of begin with some discussion about some items before we jump into the text. So there's a contrast that I want to look at here, which is the idea of voluntary or spontaneous actions or choices that people make versus rules of conduct. So when we're thinking about rules of conduct, this would be things that are prescribed that you're supposed to do in different social situations, let's say. So one of them that just kind of came to mind, which was kind of interesting for me, is this obligatory sign of respect that in this case had to do with I started exploring taking some Tai Chi, and in the location where you do it, the expectation is that you bow whenever you enter or leave the mat. And I thought this is kind of curious and especially interesting because Tai Chi kind of evolves out of more of a Taoist perspective. It's kind of considered a Taoist martial art. And how contrary is that idea that there would be this social rule that you're supposed to follow, when we see so much in the book where there's a lot of contrast between, let's say, the Confucius, who are very concerned about social order and respect and showing the correct hierarchy of relationships, whereas the Taoists seem to really challenge that frequently. So how did we end up with this idea that you're expected to show this sign of respect before you enter or when you leave the mat? Just kind of curious if you guys have any thoughts on where that might or how that might have originated before I kind of share what my thoughts are.
It's just the modernization of or the Western influence when it came here.
Well, I don't know if it's strictly a Western thing. I think this could exist in other parts of the world as well.
Okay. Other thought: is it just a symbol or a indicator that you're from your everyday life, when you just live as you are, you're kind of transitioning to say, hey, now we're going into this new world where you're going to be behaving differently? Is it like a separator between the two worlds you're interacting with in those two, during the training and outside of the training?
Well, certainly you could. There's definitely lots of examples of that kind of thing, and we definitely have lots of symbolic behaviors to denote different kinds of transitions or transformations of status that are very highly valued. But I guess what's kind of curious to me here is within something that's much more of a supposed Taoist context, where they're very against social constructs. How did this get stuck in there? Does anybody else find that ironic, or is it just me? Maybe it's just me.
Maybe it's just
I
you.
don't think I know enough about it.
Well, it's just, I mean, you think about how much we've talked about the contrast with Confucianism and Taoism, where it's like fighting against this idea of status, that you don't want to receive honor because that's meaning by default that you were seeing yourself as lower to begin with. They would not want to recognize like these class divisions. They, over and over again, it's all about going to something that's much more voluntary or spontaneous, as opposed to the socially constructed rules of behavior that they would see ultimately create the chaos, because you're trying to enforce something that's not natural. So I don't want to belabor this too much, but I find it interesting that within what you would think of as a Taoist context, that they have incorporated now these different kinds of rules that would seem like they're far more or far closer associated with something more akin to like Confucianism. So I'm just going to kind of explore this a little bit here. So there's a couple of ideas that are happening, some contrasting perspectives within the Warring States period, of which is giving rise to all these different philosophical schools in classical China. So one of them is, the big question is, what's going on with all this chaos? How do we find ourselves here? So the one answer is that the chaos is a result of a failure to conform, that there are these ways of arranging society and how you're supposed to act within society. And if everybody would just follow these standards, follow these rules, follow these hierarchies, then there would be order and everything would be fine. Okay, this would be, again, more of the Confucius view or the legalist view. And then you've got the other perspective that would be more of the Taoist concept here, then, that is saying that chaos is ensuing as a result of the imposition of ideals. And these ideals then are social constructs of what should be, as opposed to, what is and how things naturally kind of arise and function. So
I think they're both right. I think it's just different kinds of chaos. Like chaos ensues either way.
Love that.
well, and I mean, that's an interesting point that we can explore even further too, right? So I mean, you almost kind of have to start with the question of what do we mean by chaos, right?
Yeah.
So by claiming that there is chaos, we're implying that there is something that's more ordered, let's say, that we would not consider chaos. And so when something is failing to live up to that expectation, that would be, that expectation of what we think that order, the ideal order would be, right? So it's going to shift a lot on what we think that means. Like if we have something like the Confucius, where there's a very strict rules of engagement of how you relate within the family, within the state, within the particular territory, then you're going to have a clear way to see if it's being observed or not being observed. And by putting that in place and expecting it to be followed, then you have to impose it. And this would be kind of what the Taoists are saying, that there's a structure that's being imposed that's not natural. And because it's not natural, you're going to have resistance. You're going to have people that don't like it, that are going to try and buck the system or don't fit well within the system, because how can you possibly come up with a system that's going to effectively incorporate everybody, right? There's a lot of, it makes me think all of a sudden about kind of some of the discussions around modern school systems, and are they detrimental because they're trying to fit everybody into a particular box, or do we need to have something that's more expansive that accounts for the diversity of, human experience? So the Taoists would say, no matter how careful we are, no matter how informed we are, we're going to come up with these ideals that are always going to be not exactly right. And if we try to impose them, it's going to ensue with resistance in various ways. So if we're thinking about the Warring States period, obviously you've got people competing for the highest position, for that position of leadership, for that issue or position of control over others. And they would say that whole vying for those positions is only made possible because you created those positions in the first place, that you are elevating people and rewarding people for types of behavior and leadership that are contrary to more of the natural way that things would unfold. So I think that would be kind of the different ways that they have an idea of the should, in a sense, where the Taoists would say things unfold of their own way, kind of their own nature. Again, looking to something like the forest, everything just kind of does what it's supposed to do without anybody trying to tell the plants or the animals what they're supposed to be doing. It just does it, right? Without a conductor. And they definitely have a thought that there's a way that people behave when there's not a conductor that they would see as far more conducive to a full experience of life, as opposed to one where people are subjugated to ways of life that are less than fully human, let's say. So the Confucius would say, without the order, then you're inviting chaos. And so that's why they're saying that there needs to be order, that humans left to themselves don't do good. Very different contrasting ideas about things. So this would just be kind of setting the stage in very broad strokes of the two different kinds of approaches. And I think if we were to explore, kind of our Western approach, it would fall probably more on the side of the Confucius way of looking at things. That, if you look at our movies and our books and all this kind of ways that we approach fictional accounts of what happens if the government disappears or falls apart or crumbles, more often than not, our depictions are chaos, that the order and the structure that we get from the way we structure society is what keeps everything from falling apart. So we would definitely be coming from more of that kind of Confucius perspective, as opposed to this idea that if we just got rid of all of the rules and just let people be, they would figure out how to get along with each other and things would be fine. I think that might fall more like on the libertarian perspective of things. Again, very broad strokes, but this would be kind of like the two different ideas that we're looking at here. Constructs, or thinking about how it all fits together. So, and this will be coming from more of the Taoist perspective then, is the question, well, what is the motivation whereby others are trying to create these rules or rules over this idea of spontaneity? Not rule over in terms of ruling over other people, but that kind of is also the case. But the idea that there's rules versus spontaneity. And this is just kind of a high level of my thinking here, and we'll see if you guys have some additional thoughts. But one of them, I would say, is a failure to inspire. So going back to the idea of bowing before you go onto the mat. My thought on this is that at some point in the past, people were so, well, let's just say hypothetically, I don't know if this was the case, but just hypothetically, somebody discovers Taoism, or potentially, how it's getting expressed within Tai Chi. And it's made a tremendous impact on their life, and they're very grateful for it. And because of that gratefulness, they are having a spontaneous reaction of offering a bow before they go in or before they leave the mat, because it's so moved them. Now, it could be that other people saw this and were inspired by it, and they're like, yeah, that's a really good way to express what I feel about this. It really helps to demonstrate how I feel about this thing that I found in my life that's really made a big difference. And so maybe that becomes a thing. But these are going to be people who are maybe a little bit more seasoned, who've been wrestling with the ideas for a while, and it's made a big impact on them and it's really transformed them. But let's say you're somebody who's brand new to this whole thing, and you walk into it for the first time, and you see people bowing before they enter and when they leave. And, maybe you ask the question, well, why are you doing that? And they're like, well, it's just, we do it as a sign of respect. So the new person may or may not feel inspired by that, because this is brand new to them. So maybe they just were like, well, I'm going to just try this thing out. Maybe it's worthy of a bow. Maybe it's not worthy of a bow. I don't know. I'm just going to see what happens. But then the people who are there that have been using this bow are maybe a little put out that this young person, this upstart, isn't bowing. So then they try to enforce it, right? This idea that, now, I don't know if this would be the case, and especially if they were really embracing the values of Taoism, I don't think it would be something that would be make sense that they would start to try and enforce it. But I think what happens is you get removed from the original inspiration, the original reason why this started to happen, and it starts to become kind of more traditional, that we've just always kind of done it this way. And so then when that tradition gets challenged or questioned, rather than going back to what originally inspired the behavior, it becomes something that tries to be enforced. This is just the way we do things. If you want to be a part of this group, if you want to participate in learning this thing, then this is what you need to do. But now what's happened is the person's bowing, and maybe they don't have that feeling. Maybe they aren't inspired or aren't inspired yet, and they're just doing it just because you're supposed to. That's a whole different type of human reaction, right? This isn't a spontaneous reaction. This isn't a voluntary action. This is something that's now being coerced as in a context where that original inspiration isn't there. And I think there's a lot of aspects of control that happen in terms of rules that are around this idea that we would like people to, follow this particular person or work for this common cause. But if we fail to actually inspire people to want to do it, then we have to resort to coercion and to forcing them, holding their job over them for it, or compensation, or threatening with jail time, or any of the other carrots and sticks that we use to try and coerce people into certain patterns of behavior. So there's a big difference then in terms of inspiring behavior and coercing behavior. And part of the motivation for rule then would be a failure to be able to inspire. I think this is really getting at kind of a core idea within this Taoist complex. Continuing with that idea, I think would also be this pervasive thought that we have the possibility of actually controlling things. So there could be some basic things like I can grab my thermos and control it, bring it up to my mouth to drink it, so forth. And so maybe I start to think I can extend this idea of control in broader ways. Maybe my idea of control is, I can get everybody on the same page to work towards this particular goal, or we've got this project, and if I just can control all the pieces, we'll have, everything working within budget and on time, and all the stuff that we normally are caught up in trying to figure out how do we control, how do we manage things. And the reality is things just don't fit into those patterns of control. Control is really kind of a myth. There's a lot of things that we try to do to coordinate things and create a context where we can have the best possible outcome, but there's no guarantees on any of it, right? So this idea of actual control is kind of a myth, but a lot of people buy into it, and a lot of our Western world has bought into it, that really the only thing that's holding us back from everything functioning smoothly as far as our business in terms of whatever other kinds of endeavors we're involved with, is that we have to have better levels of control, better levels of information that we can use to pull the levers and twist the knobs to get everything to be aligned just right and have that level of control. If we can just get there, then everything is going to work the way we want it to. Another one would then be a failure to accept reality. So again, the Taoists would say, along with many other wisdom traditions, everything's impermanent. Everything's in flux. You don't have control over maybe anything. Maybe even the concept of free will or being a self isn't actually real. So the idea that reality as we observe it, just kind of without the filters, which is again part of this Taoist approach. How do we remove those false value judgments, the false structuring of hierarchy, so we can see clearly what is? Many times we don't like that. And so we rebel against it and we try to do something different, like this idea of control. You know, we don't like the fact that things end. So we do everything we can to stop them from ending, and try and preserve things that wouldn't normally get preserved. One of the other things we could say about that then is that there's this aspect of fear or a lack of trust that things are going to unfold in a way that they should unfold, or in a way that we want them to unfold, or we're not open to the possibilities of all the different ways it could naturally unfold, right? So this would be kind of high level thinking, my thoughts on this about, and I think this would kind of align with what I'm picking up on in terms of the general Taoist position, why they would see the inspiration or the motivation for somebody to try and have rules over just allowing things to spontaneously happen. So I'm going to pause there and see what your guys' thoughts are on that.
I can see myself in this. It reminds me of those personality tests, as in, and predictions as to who we are. Yeah, I can definitely find myself in this. Definitely prefer the rule of rules and control over uncontrollable environments, unpredictability. Mostly for the fear of consequences and lack of trust into others and such. It's all tracks with me. I'm not sure what else to say.
Yeah, so I think a lot of us, like you said, find ourselves kind of in this camp of rules, because that's a lot of how, if we grew up in the modern Western world, this is the ideas that are part of our world. It's what we teach ourselves and each other and our kids when we raise them. So it's not surprising that we have a lot of these thoughts and ideas. The Taoists are coming along and really proposing something utterly different. And in doing so, they're trying to help you see the consequences of not trusting or not accepting the kind of spontaneous unfolding of events. And I guess that's kind of more of the question. So I think we can see a lot of the same ideas about the temptations for why we want to control, why we want to enforce rules or create rules. How do you feel about this idea that, maybe we just need to relax that somewhat? And what do we think would happen if we did?
I guess my fear in that concept is that if I was to let go, others would take over. Others would take control over my, I guess, life to a degree, over my environment, over my external environment, external influence. And I'm not sure if I'm, as a person, too comfortable having someone I don't know controlling how my life evolves, and how do I experience the rest of the time, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So kind of the concern that the strong man is going to take advantage of the people who aren't standing up for themselves.
Yes, and I would actually even maybe push it further, like for this to work, I guess I imagine everybody would need to let go. And I can totally see Elon Musk letting go of his control. Yeah, right. Like, I think this needs to be a group project, not necessarily just, who subscribes to this kind of way of thinking. It seems to be a all or nothing kind of situation.
And this gets,
I think
sorry, go ahead.
I think for me, what gives me a little hope around this is that I think for a long time it's been, oh, well, we've always done it this way, or this is the traditional, respectful way of doing X, Y, and Z. But the younger generations, especially younger millennials and Gen Z, have really come to question those things. And I think that brings a lot of hope for systems like this, and maybe not the complete system, which I understand it, like that's what Taoism is talking about, is having that in the first place. But I think that's what brings me a little bit of hope around, which feels like to me a little bit of a gloomy subject when you think about it and how this has been implemented for us. But I think luckily we have a lot of people that are like, that expectation of you don't question your elders, or you just do it how it's always been done, is kind of being lifted out of the ground. So
Hmm.
I have a little hope about that, at least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely benefits to the fact that the generations turn over. One of the
Yes.
benefits of the impermanence, right, is that the newer things that are rising up have the opportunity to express themselves maybe in different ways than the prior generations did.
And they typically tend to rebel, as far as I know. It seems that they kind of try to go against the previous generation, and they don't want to do it that way.
And so this would be,
Yeah, Martin the pendulum.
yeah, and this would be very much kind of like, you know, what we were saying with the Taoist critique, that when you're trying to impose a system, you know, it doesn't fit exactly right, and so you have resistance, and this would be kind of like that rebelling against aspects that are happening. So motivation then for the rule is, you know, how do we keep all these young whippersnappers in line, you know, that think that they know better than we do, and that they're going to do things different. Whereas the younger generations, like, you know, where did these rules come from? Why are these important? You know, and if I think about this a lot in terms of the, you know, current political affairs, you know, we have so much right now of vying for voter loyalty without really offering anything other than we're better than the other guy.
Yeah, it's more of a sports competition than it is a meaningful political competition. It
Well,
shouldn't be competition. I
yeah,
mean, competition
but
wasn't the right word for the last one, but you know what I mean.
sure, but it gets back to this idea that we're trying to get things a certain way, but we're not really inspiring people to want to do it. If
Yeah.
you were able to really capture the imaginations of people and demonstrate why this is actually a good thing that we should want to do, there's a whole lot less effort involved in terms of getting people to do it. Because they can
Yeah.
see, you know, oh, this is actually makes sense. You know, I can see why this is a good thing. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff where you guys get exposed to, you know, a book or a movie, or, you know, some type of exercise program, or, you know, new recipe, and it inspires you and you just spontaneously share it with people. You know, nobody had to, you know, hire you as a marketing person to go out and do it. You're just doing it because you want to, because it inspired you, you like it, and you want to share things that you like. So there's
I discovered that, I think, a few years ago. Like, people don't like to be convinced or told to do something, or that they should do it a certain way. But if you can figure out how to inspire them to do it that way, then it's so much easier to work with them and like get them to understand the benefits of certain things, and why they should do it certain ways. It's kind of a common thread. I don't know if you've read How to Win Friends and Influence People, but I don't think he necessarily calls it out as inspiring people, but it's that same method, I think. Inspiration over trying to convince people or tell people how to do something.
yeah, Dale Carnegie, I think, is the author.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is really getting then to that same thing that the Taoists are trying to say is, you want to get rid of the conflict. If you inspire people for the behavior, it's going to be an entirely different situation than if you're trying to force them to do the situation. When you're forcing them into the situation, now you've got to expend all this effort into, the carrots and the sticks, and the fact that you've got the younger generation that's questioning things, and how do you kind of drum the questioning out of them so that they just fall into line? I mean, you've got a whole structure then that is just, in a certain sense, kind of a powder keg. And I think, we've seen over the history of humankind all kinds of structures that don't last, because ultimately they kind of cave in on themselves. They become overly rigid and concerned about keeping things the way they were when things continue to change, and you end up with new social systems that take advantage of the new technology or the new ways of thinking that end up overgrowing the old ones. And there's the transitions that happen. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think, interesting ideas that the Taoists have here, even though it seems like, doing it at just an individual level versus the entire society level are kind of two different things. And this kind of reminds us again that the Daodejing is actually addressing in many, well, the way I would say that what it's trying to address is that question about governing or rulership. So it's very much at that political level that this is coming into play, but there is also very much a personal level that comes into play, because as an individual, even if I'm living in a culture that has very strong hierarchical structures and very strong rules that you need to follow, and kind of contained within this system, I personally can still understand, the impermanence of things and what I have control over, what I don't have control over, and not fighting against the things that I can't change, learning to accept those things. And there's a lot that can be gained even at an individual level while I'm contained or forced to participate or exist within a larger system that's maybe entirely different. So a lot of kind of variations we can look at it. Definitely they're doing the critique of the society as a whole here that we're going to be looking at in this chapter, but we can also see how this comes into play at more of an individual level as well. So with that, let's actually look at the text. Now, our Addiss and Lombardo translation does a great job of representing the minimalist nature of the classical Chinese into English. And so I'm going to step through that one first, which is very minimal. And then we'll look at another translation that kind of fluffs it up a bit. It fills in kind of more of the details that aren't in the actual text, but are part of the thoughts in the text. So it starts, great Tao rejected, benevolence and righteousness appear. So with what we've just been talking about, what would you guess that this is saying?
Is that when you stray away from Taoism, your structures appear and your fights for power and hierarchy? Excuse me. Fights for hierarchy and control and power starts to come up.
Well, so benevolence and righteousness, I don't know if we'd see those necessarily as fights for power and control, but when we're talking about Tao, they're not saying Taoism at this point, right? They're not talking about their school of thought. They're talking about kind of this natural ordering of the world that is the thing that defines the Taoists, because they're concerned about looking at and seeing this natural ordering of the world and how do they participate with it? How do they act in harmony with it? So when that natural ordering of the world is rejected, is what they're saying. So not Taoism, but when people fail to pay attention to or recognize this natural ordering of the world, then benevolence and righteousness. Now, this translation is interesting. I wish they would be more consistency between the different ways that words are translated, especially between Confucianism and Taoism and some of these other things, because you notice things and how these phrases are being used. But this concept that's being translated as benevolence in other places has been translated as kindness, or as like almost more like this idea of humanity, or well, kindness is one of the key ways it gets kind of explained.
So I'm just Googling benevolence as a dictionary because, ESL don't understand. It says quality of being well-meaning, or it's also called a loving contribution, voluntary contribution, or free gift. That's not at all how I understand benevolence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this isn't, again, the different ways that things can be translated, we need to take that into effect here. But within a lot of the Taoist writings and within the Confucian and other classical writings, it'll oftentimes be translated as like kindness that comes across. So in chapter 5, we had that crazy chapter that said, heaven and earth are not kind, therefore the sage is not kind, right? And we're like, what does that mean? But we started to see that this is actually one of the key terms that's super important for the Confucius. And it's being addressed here as something that pops up when the Tao isn't being followed or recognized. So we have something that maybe we would all say is a good thing, right? It would be good to be kind. But then it kind of comes up as a category, almost more like a should, that didn't used to be there. So we think about with the bowing of the mat situation, the spontaneous reaction of people who've been inspired by the teaching, that are moved by it, showing their reference by bowing, and then later people having to be forced to do it. There's a difference, because when somebody's inspired to do it, they just do it because they want to. It's spontaneous, it's voluntary. But as soon as you make it into a rule, somebody may or may not actually have that internal feeling that this is something that they should do. So here we've got then this idea of benevolence or kindness and righteousness, right action or ritual, appear in the whole context only after you walk away from a situation where it should spontaneously happen. So then it becomes almost kind of by rote. We'll see how this kind of plays out with the other ones, because it's kind of like this ongoing kind of devolving. So it starts with forgetting or not noticing or paying attention to the Tao, and that devolves, in this case, to kindness and righteousness. And then it says, and then learning and knowledge are professed, right? So there's like this kind of new wisdom that kind of emerges. But once that happens, it says great hypocrisies spring up. So we're tumbling further down. It says family relations forgotten, filial piety and affection arise. The nation disordered, patriots come forth. So it's kind of this tumbling down of all these different things. And you can see that when, like in this case, going back with like the family, when the family's functioning well and it's in harmony, you don't have to tell parents to love their kids. You don't have to tell kids to love their parents. But if things are completely out of whack and it's very dysfunctional, then all of a sudden you're in a situation where you need to tell the kids, hey, you have a duty to show respect to your parents. Whole different ballgame, right? Now you're getting into something where you're trying to enforce behavior because this is what they should do rather than what would spontaneously evolve in a more of a normal situation. And then the same thing happens with the state, right? It falls into disorder because things are coming apart, maybe because the family systems are breaking down, maybe because there's all this hypocrisy that's coming through this learning, and that the basic values of kindness and there's different ways it gets translated, whether it's justice or ritual or righteousness, that stuff starts to become required as opposed to just kind of spontaneously developed. And so then what happens? You end up with what sometimes is translated as loyal ministers of the state pop up, right? Or here, I like that he's using the word patriots, because now you've got people who are, fighting for and defending something even against potentially logic is the idea here. It's not against people being proud of and supportive of their country. It's when things start to devolve that you get people who are like standing up saying, you must, right? It's like, it's the kind of fighting that we're seeing now between the two different like political parties, where each is claiming to have the upper hand in terms of what is the best way to represent the country. That's the kind of idea that it's coming up here. It's not simply talking about people who are proud to be part of a country because the country is doing amazing things. It's where you start to get people who are disenfranchised because they're being left out, or there's parts of the whole populations that are suffering mightily that can't speak about it because these other types of voices are trying to drown it out, to try and keep that idea that everything's okay here. You're the problem, not the state. Everything kind of devolves.
Yeah, calling them patriots, you can kind of tell like the perspective that it's trying to give by calling them patriots. Like it's making them sound like a good thing, but why do we need them in the first place? Like if we didn't have this disorder, then we wouldn't need it.
Yeah, that's
It's
definitely
like when you treat your symptoms, like you're sick and you treat your symptoms versus treating the root cause.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to look at another translation of the same passage that kind of fills out a little bit more of what we were talking about in the actual translation itself. And it's going to start by adding, there's stuff here that's just not in the text, but it's in the thought of the text. So just kind of keep that in mind when we look at it. It says, when the greatness of Tao is present, action arises from one's own heart. Okay, so that would be kind of the context that's not in the text, but it's kind of underlying it, right? That there's this idea that there's this spontaneity, that there's this inspiration, that there's this voluntariness that happens when people are connected and recognizing and seeing kind of the grandeur of life, let's say, and how it kind of unfolds, and paying attention to those natural processes, that there's a way of engaging with that just kind of spontaneously comes forth. When the greatness of Tao is absent, now it wouldn't be absence in the sense that it actually goes away. It's more along the lines of when it's forgotten or not paid attention to. Action comes from the rules of kindness and justice. If you need rules to be kind and just, if you act virtuous, this is a sure sign that virtue is absent. Thus, we see great hypocrisy. Only when the family loses its harmony do we hear of dutiful sons. Only when the state is in chaos do we hear of loyal ministers. So, we got a few minutes left. Any concluding thoughts on this that you'd like to share or talk about, or questions?
Right.
What was that?
This is a very interesting, or it's a good food for thought. Again, just like in many other previous sessions, Jim, this is a lot of, hey, I never thought of it from this perspective. Thank you. Good.
Did people like this chapter?
Yeah, I like this one. I like this thing at the end too. I don't know, the reference is star. I don't know if this is something that's common for each of the chapters, but I like it. It's kind of like a summary of the message. It's
He's another translator, and I'm drawing a blank on his first name here. Let's see, it's Jonathan Starr is his first name, if you're wanting to follow up on that.
okay.
I like to consult what he has to say, but as you can see, he kind of adds a lot to the translation, which is why I don't normally use his stuff, because he definitely tries to bring out more of the thought as opposed to simply doing the translation, which you always have to do. It's always kind of this balancing between, doing kind of a thought for thought translation versus a word for word translation. If you just simply did a word for word translation, it might not be intelligible. It might not even be formatted properly for English. So you always have to incorporate more of what are they trying to say with this in the translation. But the further you go down that road of thought for thought, the more the particular bias of the translator comes into play. And sometimes his bias is in agreement with what I'm seeing with the other stuff and kind of where I come from, because I definitely come from a particular perspective. I'm not coming from the religious Taoist perspective. I'm coming from more of a naturalist interpreter of Taoism. And sometimes he comes from a perspective that's not as useful for me, but it's always good to see where he's coming from. And in his larger book, he's got one that's a small book that's just the actual translation, and another one that gets into far more of the commentary on why he did the translation the way he did, and so forth. So I find it a good reference in that regard. Well, if there's no other comments, we'll go ahead and bring this to the close. And if you've been watching this and you'd like to join us, you can go to www.kinship.cafe and register your email. And you'll get links for our live Zoom presentation that happens on Friday mornings. There's also a in-person class that happens if you happen to be in the Southern California area on Sunday mornings. And we'll love to see you next time. So take care, everyone.